Nina sighed as she looked at the crumbling facade of her childhood home. The years had not been kind to the small cottage in the heart of the village. Her father had passed away, leaving behind a legacy of kindness that seemed to have faded with time. She remembered how he would always talk about karma, the idea that good or bad actions would bring about corresponding consequences in the future. Nina didn't believe in karma. Life had been hard on her despite her efforts to do good. She had moved to the city, worked tirelessly, and yet, here she was, back in the village with nothing to show for it. As she walked through the dusty streets, she saw familiar faces. Some greeted her warmly, others with indifference, and a few with thinly veiled contempt. One face stood out among them, a tall, imposing man named Raj. He had made her life miserable during her school days with his constant bullying. Nina had always wondered how someone so cruel could prosper. Raj now owned the largest house in the village, and his business ventures had made him wealthy. Nina's thoughts were interrupted by a small voice. "Nina, is that you?" She turned to see Mrs. Patel, the village's elderly baker, who had always been kind to her. "Mrs. Patel, it's so good to see you," Nina exclaimed, hugging her tightly. "You must come by the bakery," Mrs. Patel insisted. "I just made fresh bread." As they walked to the bakery, Mrs. Patel filled Nina in on the village's happenings. Nina listened politely, her thoughts still heavy with her own troubles. When they arrived, the warm smell of baking bread filled the air, and Nina felt a small comfort in the familiarity of it. While they sat and chatted over tea, the doorbell tinkled, and in walked Raj. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Nina. "Nina, long time no see," Raj said, attempting a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Raj," Nina replied coolly. Raj seemed oblivious to her discomfort. He bought his bread and left, but not before bragging about his latest business success. Nina felt her blood boil. How could someone like him have everything? Mrs. Patel noticed her anger and placed a gentle hand on Nina's. "Karma, my dear," she said softly. Nina shook her head. "I don't believe in karma anymore, Mrs. Patel. Look at Raj. He's a terrible person, yet he has everything." Mrs. Patel smiled knowingly. "Patience, Nina. Karma doesn't work on our timeline, but it always finds its way." Days turned into weeks, and Nina busied herself with repairing her father's house. One evening, while she was painting the porch, a young boy approached her, tears streaming down his face. "Miss Nina, can you help me? My mother is very sick." Nina recognized him as Raj's son. Her initial instinct was to refuse, but something in the boy's eyes reminded her of her own father's teachings. "Of course," she said, setting down her paintbrush. At Raj's house, she found his wife burning with fever. Nina rushed to get the village doctor and stayed to help care for her. She spent days nursing Raj's wife back to health, ignoring the resentment she felt towards Raj. His wife slowly recovered, and Raj, seeing Nina's selflessness, was at a loss for words. One afternoon, as Nina was about to leave, Raj stopped her. "Nina, I don't know how to thank you," he began, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "I've been terrible to you, yet you helped my family without hesitation." Nina looked him in the eye. "I did it for your wife and son. They are innocent." Raj hung his head in shame. "I realize now how my actions have hurt people. I want to make amends." Nina was skeptical, but nodded. "It's never too late to change, Raj." Word of Nina's kindness spread through the village, and slowly, her father's home became a symbol of goodwill. People started coming to her for advice, help, and simply to share a cup of tea. She found herself becoming an integral part of the community once more. Raj, true to his word, began to change. He apologized to those he had wronged, and his business practices became more ethical. He even started a fund to help the less fortunate in the village, inspired by Nina's example. One day, as Nina was tending to her garden, Mrs. Patel visited her. "I told you, karma always finds its way," she said, her eyes twinkling. Nina smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She realized that her father's lessons about karma were true, not because of some mystical force, but because kindness begets kindness. The good she had done had come back to her in ways she had never expected. As she watched the sun set over the village, Nina felt hopeful. She had found her place, not through wealth or success, but through the simple, profound act of doing good. And in that, she discovered the true essence of karma.